Hello, and welcome to GLISA's walkthrough of the flood factor tool. GLISA, or the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, is one of 11 regional integrated sciences and assessment teams supported by NOAA, dedicated to helping the nation prepare for and adapt to climate variability and change. Many practitioners we work with in the Great Lakes region utilize tools like flood factor, but require more guidance on how to use them and implement the data and information into their planning. This video is intended to help such users to better understand this tool and its potential applications. This video was created by GLISA for public use and is not affiliated with flood factor in any way. In this video, we will give a general introduction to the tool and a walkthrough of how to use the tool and interpret the outputs for individual properties, as well as larger areas such as zip codes, cities, counties, and states. The First Street Foundation Flood Factor tool was developed to make flood risk information accessible, understandable, and usable. Flood risk information based on rainfall, riverine flooding, tidal flooding, and storm surge from the tool is meant to be used along with any local resources available to the user, including FEMA flood maps or any personal records. The data on the First Street Foundation Flood Factor tool is available freely to all. To use the tool, first navigate to floodfactor.com. Flooding information can be obtained for specific properties, zip codes, cities, counties, or states. Depending on the size of the location chosen, the outputs of the tool will be slightly different. For example, a statewide analysis will be less specific than a property analysis. We will start by discussing flood risks for a property, noting the differences later. Once the location has been selected, the tool will output a page with extensive information about flooding risks for the property. The first metric is the flood factor score assigned to the chosen location. This is a number between 1 and 10, with 10 being the highest flooding risk and 1 being the lowest. For this property, the flood factor score is a 7, which corresponds to severe flooding risk. To understand the flood factor score, it is important to look at the variables that go into its calculation. This is the flood factor matrix. The overall score given to a property is dependent on the likelihood of flooding in a 30-year period and the depth of that flooding. Therefore, properties with higher probabilities of flooding, higher flood depths, or both will be assigned a higher flood factor score. The next section shows the property's likelihood of experiencing floods of certain depths over different time periods. Flood risks are cumulative, meaning that risks become greater as the time period increases. Specifically, looking at this property's risk of flooding greater than 6 inches increases from 10% in 1 year to 96% in 30 years. The percentage of properties at risk in the county in which the property is located is presented alongside these probabilities. To see more specific information about the county as a whole, click on the name highlighted in blue. We will discuss the information presented for the county later in this overview. For the sake of comparison, A map of the area in which the chosen property is located is provided. Each colored dot corresponds to the flood factor risk level of the property. These dots can be toggled on and off based on the risk bracket they are in using these buttons. To help understand the magnitude of different floods, the next section allows you to click through flooding amounts to see the possible impacts. For example, a flood of 6 inches to 1 foot can damage wood floors and carpet, drywall, yards, insulated appliances, and render most cars unable to drive. Understanding the impacts of different magnitudes of flooding is important for making decisions about how to protect your property. Due to climate change, flood risks for your property may be changing. The next section gives flooding likelihoods for specifically chosen probabilities for this year, 15 years in the future, and 30 years in the future. The information is presented in multiple ways. First, it is presented as a table with the flooding likelihood and the amount of water that will reach the building. This same information is also displayed on a satellite map of the area surrounding the chosen property. The colors on the map correspond to the colors in this bar. For example, this map shows that in 2021, the property has a 0.2% chance of experiencing flooding depths of 7.1 feet to 8 feet. The same visuals are given for projected flooding in 15 and 30 years, respectively. Risk factors for flooding are changing due to environmental changes. The flood factor tool shows projections for changes in precipitation, sea level, and sea surface temperatures. However, for the Great Lakes region, the only applicable category is precipitation change. The model does not yet include projections for changes in lake levels or lake surface temperatures for the Great Lakes. Precipitation changes are presented on a map of the continental United States for the current year, 15 years in the future, and 30 years in the future. The color denotes whether precipitation totals are projected to increase or decrease, and by what percentage. The flood factor tool presents possible strategies to mitigate flooding risk for your property. These strategies are broken up into categories based on price range. Cheaper solutions include rain barrels and clearing gutters, while the most expensive solutions include elevating your home above the height of most flood levels. The final piece of information given by the tool about your specific property is a table that can be used to understand flooding risks in the surrounding zip code, city, county, and state. General statistics for each are given in the table. Risk status shows whether the number of properties at risk from flooding will increase or decrease over the next 30 years. This is broken down into the number of properties at risk this year, the number at risk in 30 years, and the percent change. To find out more specific information about your zip code, city, county, or state, click on View Page below your desired area. For a specific zip code, you will see almost all of the same types of information as with a specific property, with an addition of this graph that shows the projections for how the number of properties at risk will change over the next 30 years. The light blue section shows the possible percent changes of properties at risk over the next 30 years. Also, with a bigger area, the flood factor tool suggests community solutions for mitigating flooding risks rather than individual actions. Options for green and gray infrastructure are given, along with possible resilience measures. All of the same information given for the chosen zip code or county is also given for the chosen city, just over a larger area. Flood risk information can also be seen for entire states. Just like zip codes or counties, you will see a graph that shows the projected percent increase in properties at risk over the next 15 and the next 30 years. This section also includes both the county and the city that are projected to have the greatest percent increases in properties at risk over the next 30 years. Again, just like zip codes, counties, cities, or individual properties, environmental changes can be investigated for the state. For the Great Lakes region, only precipitation changes are relevant, as changes in lake levels and lake surface temperatures for the Great Lakes are not yet included in the model. A map of the state with colored dots showing the different flood factor scores for properties all over the state is presented next. This can be useful to see which parts of the state have the highest flood risks. Information about historical flooding events in the chosen state is also presented. Flood Factor has modeled multiple historical flooding events. With a map and a color bar showing flooding depths, the tool shows how many properties were impacted by the chosen event. Different events can be chosen using this drop-down menu. The tool will also tell you whether there is any kind of infrastructure or flood mitigation strategies in place that impacted the effects of the event. Next, flood risk projections for the state are presented just as they are for properties, zip codes, cities, and counties. The number of properties at risk nationally is presented on a map for the current year and for 15 and 30 years in the future, respectively. This information can help contextualize the risk and how it will change in the future in your chosen state as compared to the rest of the continental United States. The size of the red circle corresponds to the number of properties at risk. Similar information about how flood risk will change in 30 years throughout the entire continental United States is also presented in percent form. The color corresponds to the magnitude of the change in flood risk, and an overall percent increase is given for each state. As with properties, zip codes, cities, and counties, the flood factor tool gives suggestions for flood mitigation strategies in your state. Green and gray infrastructure ideas, as well as resilience strategies, are presented. To conclude, the First Street Foundation Flood Factor tool makes flood risk information accessible, understandable, and usable. For more information about the tool, specific data sets used, and the underlying flood model, please visit this link to see the full tool evaluation done by GLISA, or the link below to see more information on the flood factor methodology.